Have you ever asked yourself who we are? Where do we come from and where will we go? Why? What is the purpose of our existence? Those are certainly important questions that often trouble not just you, but all of humanity. Let's join Rido to reflect and explore in today's video. Who am I? This agonizing question must have been raised since the dawn of time, when humans first became aware of their existence in this life, and within the scope of each of our lives. It seems to have arisen at some very early point that we rarely remember, only to continue pursuing us persistently until the very end of our lives. Who am I to come and go in this life without knowing the cause and purpose? Who am I that from nothingness suddenly exists as a living being full of aspiration? Who am I that eventually must give up this life as an inevitability while still deeply loving and attached? Why are we born? Why must we die? Why and why? If we cannot answer questions of this kind, we will never be able to understand the true meaning of our own existence in this life, nor understand the meaning of the things we do, of the efforts whether to aim for a noble life, or just to hustle and compete for a better life. However, there are different ways to answer a question. For example, the answer could be to provide content the questioner wants to know. Those who try to answer in this way construct a certain image that created humans, such as assuming humans were born of God, created by God's power. If we accept that, it means we already have the answer to the questions raised above. And if we need to raise more related questions, perhaps we have to wait till we meet God. But it seems the civilization of humanity in this 21st century can no longer accept such highly imaginative answers. We need a more reasonable way of perception so as not to be stuck feeling like we are living a meaningless life, just waiting for the time to leave without understanding the cause why, nor knowing where we will go. Thus, it seems the effort to answer by providing the content the questioner wants to know has failed. A different way of answering is to turn to analyzing the content of the question itself. If the questioner can realize the irrationality in the question, they will no longer want to know the answer, and thus the questioner is also considered satisfied. The Buddha chose this method of answering when he analyzed the connotation of the word self in the question and pointed out that there is essentially no such self. When there is no self, the question "who am I?" becomes no longer rational simply because one cannot offer any image or concept to describe something that does not exist. And therefore, we cannot be anyone when the self essentially does not exist. And a series of related questions are also considered simultaneously resolved. We do not need to wonder about the coming and going of a self that does not exist. Instead, the more correct questions now will turn to a different category. How can such an unreal self exist in our perception as something very real? And how can a world with such unreal selves operate according to very real principles, creating the overlapping affinity and karma of all sentient beings in this realm? Answering these questions will be a positive process of practice, contemplating to the very root of the arising of all dharmas phenomena and the cause and effect that govern every phenomenon. In the scriptures, the Buddha repeatedly pointed out that the self of every sentient being is a collection of compounds, specifically constituted by the five aggregates, where each aggregate itself is also a collection consisting of many factors. The five aggregates listed are the form aggregate, feeling aggregate, perception aggregate, mental formations aggregate, and consciousness aggregate. Among these, the form aggregate is a compound of sounds, forms, sense, tastes combined with our senses like eyes, ears, nose, tongue. Each factor therein is a necessary condition to create what is called the form aggregate. The form aggregate also includes the senses themselves, such as eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and their objects, because they are all composed of matter. These are what we can observe, The feeling aggregate refers to sensations that arise when our body comes into contact with external objects, such as pleasant feelings, joyful emotions, painful feelings, uncomfortable, unliked emotions, and neutral feelings, emotions of suffering that are not joyful. The perception aggregate refers to recognition and distinction regarding objects after contact, such as distinguishing whether an object is long or short, big or small, blue, yellow, white, or red, up to distinguishing whether it is good, evil, wrong, or right. The mechanism of perception is precisely based on searching within memory for images and information from the past related to the object, and through that, determining and giving rise to distinction. The mental formations aggregate generally refers to all psychological activities or reactions of the consciousness oozing after contacting and distinguishing objects, such as liking, loathing, praising, or criticizing. Formation is a complex element because it covers a very wide scope and has the ability to act as a cause for other activities of the body and mind, while aggregates like form, feeling, and perception are just existing phenomena that do not create causes. Because of this, the mental formations aggregate has two distinct roles. The mental formations aggregate acts as a result when the reactions of the consciousness or results created by other conditions and factors. The mental formations aggregate acts as a cause when the reactions of the consciousness become conditions leading to behaviors and activities of the body, speech, and mind. In this sense, the activities of the body, speech, and mind are the expression of the mental formations aggregate and are the result of the impact of the mental formations aggregate. The final component in the five aggregates is the consciousness aggregate, referring generally to the function of consciousness, that is, the awareness manifested at all senses, such as eye consciousness at the eyes, ear consciousness at the ears, up to mind consciousness. Detailed analyses like the above have given us a true way of perceiving what is called self currently existing in this life. Each element analyzed above appears very real in our ordinary perception, but will reveal their fragile, falsely compounded nature due to dependent arising when contemplated amidst the light of prana wisdom. Through that, we can see that precisely the results of practicing the wisdom of emptiness will also help us realize the falsely compounded nature of a self that we have long viewed as a singular, solid, and enduring entity. Buddhism calls this true perception the insight of no self, in the sense that there is absolutely no ego, no self existing solidly and independently, and the reality we are perceiving. Recognizing the fragile, falsely compounded, and unreal nature of the self composed of the five aggregates does not mean denying its existence in this phenomenal world. On the contrary, precisely this perception of the truth will help the self become better and more meaningful throughout its time of existence. Instead of being drawn in and urged by desires to build up, nourish, and protect an unreal self, only to endlessly cause harm to oneself and others, we will be able to look back at the issue more lucidly and clearly see what should be done to bring about true happiness in this life. Thanks to clearly seeing that falsely compounded self existing in a relative world operating according to the principles of dependent arising and cause and effect, where all our emotions and thoughts incessantly rise and cease within that flow, we know objectively that it is precisely our behaviors, speech, or thoughts that will determine whether that self exists in peace and happiness, or must be submerged in suffering and affliction. In other words, we have the choice to decide our existence in the phenomenal world in whatever way, without accepting it as the arrangement of any mysterious supernatural force or fate. Everything is decided by us. Cause and effect is a complex problem with many participating factors to form a result. The most decisive factors are always the perception and thoughts of our own selves. As taught in the Dhammapada, Mind precedes all mental states. Mind is their chief. They are all mind-made. If with an impure mind a person speaks or acts, suffering follows him like the wheel that follows the foot of the ox. Mind precedes all mental states. Mind is their chief. They are all mind-made. If with a pure mind a person speaks or acts, happiness follows him like his never-departing shadow. These two verses are simple, easy to understand, but extremely profound teachings that can be a compass for our entire lives. With faith and correct perception of the principles stated in the verses, we are no longer bewildered before the storms of life and can clearly recognize what should be done or not done. Considered from the perspective of whether we want a life of happiness or suffering, when abandoning the wrong perception of a self that is solid and exists separately from all objects outside it as a subject that creates and receives the results of creation, we will escape the bondage to desires and cravings revolving around an unreal self. We will see that we truly have the need to protect the self, to build up the self to have happiness, as we imagined. Even when we try every way to satisfy the demands of that self, we still do not attain happiness, because true happiness only comes when we know how to speak or act with a pure and virtuous mind. There are questions that will be raised here. Can I still try to behave with a pure mind without needing to perceive differently about the self? To me, it is a very real entity, completely distinct from all other entities and objects. Without the self, what do I rely on to practice? And without the self, even if I create happiness, who will enjoy that happiness? These questions sound reasonable and are even very commonly encountered in anyone because they stem from the root of a self that has long been acknowledged as a matter of course. The truth is, without the detailed and clear analyses and guidance of the Buddha, perhaps we ourselves would find it very difficult to have the ability to contemplate deeply enough to recognize the falsely compounded and temporary nature of the self. Furthermore, even when having contemplated and seen the falsely compounded and unreal nature of such a self, the effort to completely abandon the attachment and clinging to the self remains a long and extremely difficult process, requiring perseverance and lucidity to be gradually achieved. Buddhist terminology calls the clinging and attachment to the unreal, falsely compounded self-ego attachment, and practice is the process of breaking that ego attachment to reach a true perception called no-self, seeing through and truly seeing the temporary, fragile nature of this body-mind aggregate, thereby gaining the ability to abandon all greed and clinging to it. Answering the first question, is it possible to practice a pure mind without letting go of the self? Or put differently, does accepting the self as a solidly existing entity hinder behaving with a pure mind? This is a very practical doubt, but in fact, it has been answered right in practical experiences, and answering this question also simultaneously resolves the doubts and the remaining questions. In reality, if indeed we could find true happiness by behaving with a pure and virtuous mind without needing to abandon ego attachment, then the practice of no-self would certainly be unnecessary. But the truth is not so. Ego attachment will cloud our mind right from the moment any thought arises, even if it is a virtuous thought. For example, when you generate the mind to give charity and help others, ego attachment will simultaneously generate obstructing concepts by comparing oneself with the object being helped, generating a feeling of disadvantage for oneself when giving away things that are currently mine. And when you have actually done the act of charity, you will generate a concept expecting a repayment in the future for this self because of having done a meritorious deed. These subtle thoughts arise completely naturally on the foundation of ego attachment. We even rarely pay attention to distinguish them. Therefore, our good behaviors are very difficult to rise, and even if we try to perform them, the positive effectiveness will also be greatly limited. The Diamond Sutra calls this giving with attachment to form. We have a clear distinction between the giver and the receiver, and precisely that distinction generates the concepts mentioned above. When contemplating and clearly seeing the falsely compounded nature of the five aggregates as empty, we also simultaneously see that all dharmas arise due to conditions and have no solid permanence. From there, we can let go of the clinging and greed for a self that essentially does not exist. Thanks to that, when practicing vows such as loving kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity, or the paramitas such as charity, morality, and patience, we will no longer be hindered by attachment to the ego. Based on realized experience, the Buddha clearly pointed out in many scriptures that attachment to the ego is the very root of countless mental afflictions. Each of us can experience this truth ourselves by contemplating our own minds to clearly see the process of rising of mental afflictions such as craving, hatred, jealousy, and envy. If there were no ego attachment as a foundation, those thoughts would have nowhere to rely on to rise. Furthermore, even when those thoughts have arisen and are rising, if we know how to practice contemplating no self, we will immediately see the reduction of their impact on our thoughts, behaviors, and speech. We will have more ability to choose and decide for ourselves instead of always being urged and ordered unconditionally by craving, hatred, or jealousy and envy.